Working class man. Class struggle is identity politics. Working hard to make a living, bringing shelter from the rain. A father's son left to carry on, blue denim in his veins. Oh, 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 he's a working class man. Working hard to make a living, bringing shelter from the rain. A father's son left to carry on, blue denim in his veins. Oh, he's a working class man. Jimmy Barnes, 1985. Jimmy Barnes' song, Working Class Man, resonated with many Australian citizens and still does to this day. Being of a certain economic class, in this case, the working class, gives this song an extra level of appreciation from Australians. Therefore, being of a particular economic group is not merely an arbitrary description of wealth and income, but a significant part of who you are, your identity. However, there are those who believe that class politics and IP are distinct from one another. For example, Brendan O'Neill says in a debate on IP, 2016, claimed that class politics is not a form of IP. He says this because people of economic classes do not associate that as part of their identity, and gives the example of working class people moving into the middle and upper class. To address this objection, I will first summarize the Marxist approach to class. Marxism is any theory that critically analyzes capitalism through, appropriately enough, Marxist theory. Many Marxists may be in favor of socialism overthrowing capitalism, but it is not necessarily the case. At this point, many readers may recoil at the very mention of Marx and Marxism, and this is unsurprising. To paraphrase Noam Chomsky, American Feud, 2008, modern politics and economics has gotten to the point of loathing Karl Marx and worshipping Adam Smith, but reading neither of them. The consequence of such a belief is to completely misunderstand class conflict and class struggle. Furthermore, such misunderstandings lead to conflating Marxism with other philosophies, such as postmodernism. Jordan Peterson, 2017, commits such conflations with his use of terms such as postmodern neo-Marxists and cultural Marxists. Peterson, 2017, believes that IP is a rebranding of Marxism by these ideologies. He believes this since Marxism had apparently failed. They had to bring identity and culture in as the new oppressor and oppressed narrative. And that is what Peterson claims that postmodernism, gender, race theorists, and Marxists all hold. That is a narrative of the oppressors and of the oppressed. An uncharitable way of interpreting Peterson's critique is that there is something intrinsically wrong with any narrative that argues that there are oppressors and the oppressed. If that is how we should understand Marxism, then Marxism has existed ever since slaves realized what was happening to them seemed to be a bit unfair. From this, if we believe that any narrative of oppressor and oppressed is intrinsically wrong, then such campaigns as ending the slave trade was intrinsically wrong. Hence, to characterize all these philosophies as being flawed due to adhering to a narrative of oppressor and oppressed demonstrates a serious misunderstanding and oversimplification of Marxism. Indeed, in a debate Jordan Peterson had with Slavoj Žižek, 2019, made a point about one of Peterson's 12 rules for life: get your own house in order before you criticize the world, which was that sometimes one's house is not in order because of the society they are living in. From this, Zizek asked Peterson to imagine telling someone in North Korea to get their house in order before criticizing the world. A more charitable way of interpreting Peterson's critique is that Marxism and postmodernism share the view that the only way to understand the world is through oppressors and oppressed. The problem with this interpretation of Marxism is that it is at best too simplistic, and at worst just plain wrong. Marx's theory, although does include acknowledging the exploitation and alienation of the working class, which one may want to call oppression, although once again would be too simplistic, Marx's theory also includes a materialist view of history, the labour theory of value, and so on. For a detailed explanation of these theories, www.marxists.org is a helpful resource. Since this understanding of Marxism is inadequate, it is worth discussing the basics of Marxist theory. Without summarizing all of Marx's work, I'll go over his main views that I believe are most relevant to class analysis and their analogies to IP, which are exploitation and consciousness raising. Exploitation is where, under a capitalist system, when someone owns property that can provide the public with goods and services, which is described in Marxist jargon as the means of production, profit can only be made by exploiting the workers that assist in providing those goods and services. I. Sakasaka, 1967. For example, if I own a store, I will need to hire workers. Such workers will be frontline reception and salespeople. These people are necessary for the store to run. The exploitation comes from the fact that in order to make a profit, I need to pay my workers less than what they collectively contribute to the running of the business. If I did pay them what they collectively contribute, then it would conflict with my ability to make a profit. Since businesses need to make a profit under a capitalist system, it therefore demands paying workers less than their proportionate contribution. This is what makes this exploitative in Marxist terms. A common response is that this is not exploitative because the worker has freely chosen to sell their labour at a lower price. The argument is that they do not have to work at that price, and nothing can stop the worker leaving and working somewhere else at a fairer price. The first response to this is that since exploitation is necessary in a capitalist economic structure, this is merely attempting to minimize the exploitation. Claiming that one is not exploited since they can look for work elsewhere is also very counterintuitive. Consider how you'd feel if your job was at risk. For most of us, our reaction would not be, oh well, I'll just get another job when I lose this one. In the world we live in, we are not free to be gainfully employed with ease, and many employers are aware of this. Some employers will willfully take advantage of this, whilst others will not. So, to ensure our employment, many of us will accept lower pay to guarantee employment. This is not because of some arbitrary choice, but because of the fear of being unable to meet basic needs. If the choice is to be exploited or live in poverty, then it is no choice at all. This is exploitation in a nutshell. Consciousness raising will be discussed next. Consciousness raising is when workers realize their position of being exploited as a working class and come together to bring about change. I. Sakasaka, 1967. Marx ultimately saw this as seizing the means of production from the capitalists through revolution. However, one can be class conscious without full-blown socialist revolution. A prime example is the labour union movements throughout history. Although it is true that labour unions existed prior to Marx, many labour unions adopted Marx's philosophy and concepts of class struggle. Consider the union song Solidarity Forever and these two verses. Pete Seeger, 2011. It is we who ploughed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving midst the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. These lyrics certainly contain the concepts of class consciousness and exploitation. One could argue that being of the working class is disanalogous to identities invoked in IP. Brendan O'Neill, 2016, argue that being of the working class is something they wanted to rise out of through social mobility. Even so, under the definition of ascriptive identity, whether they want to move out of that class or not, it is still part of their ascriptive identity. Furthermore, in a capitalist structure, there will always be people in the working class. Ben Burgess, 2019, points out that even though individuals can move out of the working class, it does not mean that all of them can. If we all get PhDs, we'll still need people to do the unskilled labour. The idea of the working class, at least in Marxist terms, as a situation one wants to rise out of into a middle or upper class is incorrect. The goal of socialism is a classless society, not to move those in the lower classes into the upper classes. One may object that this enforces the point that class is different from identity, since it is something we want to get rid of. We want to get rid of class divisions. Whereas, identities such as race and gender involve a recognition. However, returning to the concept of ascriptive identity, this is a case where being born into a particular economic class influences your advantages, disadvantages, and life chances. So until the class of society is realized, being of the working class remains a part of ascriptive identity. Therefore, there seems to be no reason to have them excluded as a part of IP. Furthermore, the origins of IP through the CRC have always assumed this. In the What We Believe section of the CRC's statement, they say, "We realize that the liberation of all oppressed peoples necessitates the destruction of the political economic systems of capitalism and imperialism as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that the work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, and not for the profit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed amongst those who create those resources. We are not convinced, however, that the socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation. We have arrived at the necessity for developing an understanding of class relationships that takes into account the specific class position of black women who are generally marginal in the labour force. While at this particular time some of us are temporarily viewed as doubly desirable tokens at white-collar and professional levels, we need to articulate the real class situation of persons who are not merely raceless, sexless workers, but for whom racial and sexual oppression are significant determinants in their working economic lives. Although we are in essential agreement with Marx's theory as it is applied to the very specific economic relationships he analysed, we know that his analysis must be extended further in order for us to understand our specific economic situation as black women. To further endorse this point, Barbara Smith, who was one of the members of the CRC, had this to say regarding Bernie Sanders, 2020. Those ideas continue to reverberate today. I am often disheartened, however, to see support for identity politics and intersectionality reduced to buzzwords. I am supporting Bernie Sanders for president because I believe that his campaign and his understanding of politics complements the priorities of women of colour defined decades ago. So, the origins of the concept of IP had always assumed class struggle as not something separate to IP, but as something to be expanded upon. Returning to the concept of intersectionality, class can be observed as part of the identity that is also acknowledged. Intersectional analysis has revealed historically that wealthy homosexuals experience different kinds of oppression than poor homosexuals due to their ability to cover up their lifestyle. And today similar analogies can be made regarding transgender persons. Wealthy transgender persons have the means to transition through surgeries and hormone therapy, whereas transgender persons living in poverty have much more difficulty gaining access to these services. This is the class dynamic that shows how the experiences of homosexuals and transgender persons, although are shared in some ways, are distinct in others. Hence, IP is intersectional, and class is included as one of those intersections. Inclusion of class as an identity in IP will be useful when I consider criticisms of IP not from the conservative right or the IDW, but from the socialist left, which will be discussed next.